Thank you everyone for being here. I'll be presenting my dissertation research, Sustainable Sourcing in Agricultural Supply Chains, an Analysis Across Scales. So what kind of motivates my work? I'm really interested in kind of global challenges that face our planet today. Things like climate change, extreme poverty, workers' rights, and deforestation. And in particular, I care about those problems as they relate to agriculture. Agriculture is incredibly important in relationship to these challenges because agriculture touches all of these components. Agriculture contributes an estimated 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and most of the most marginalized workers in the world work in agricultural supply chains. But so how do we solve these really major challenges? Well, often we turn to governments. Through top-down regulations or local legislation, governments step in and regulate these social or environmental challenges. Increasingly, we're also turning to international treaties, such as the Paris Climate Accord, to regulate global challenges. But increasingly, academics understand that there's a role of private governance in these major challenges. So groups, nonprofits and civil society can engage in the regulation of these challenges through community management or sustainable certification at the factory or farm level. And similarly, companies can address these issues either through their own operations or through their supply chain. So understanding this complex policy ecosystem, I focus specifically on company supply chains. Why supply chains? First, what is a supply chain? A supply chain connects raw material producers to end users through a number of entities that kind of a product goes through. So for example, let's say you're eating a chocolate bar. That chocolate originally came from cocoa, primarily produced in West Africa. It was then sold to major traders. It was processed. Then maybe a distributor took it and sold it on to a major chocolate company such as Hershey's or Mars. And finally, a retailer sold it to you. Supply chains are interesting because it's estimated that 500 companies control 70% of production. So they're a really interesting leverage point to try to drive change. Second, it's estimated that 1 in 5 jobs are tied to global supply chains. So many workers are touched through these systems. And finally, it's estimated that 80% of environmental impacts of major companies come from their supply chains. So yes, it's helpful if major companies kind of retrofit their buildings and change their light bulbs, but much of their environmental impact comes from the upstream supply that they get their materials from. Specifically, my research looks at how and why do companies address sustainable sourcing in their agricultural supply chains. And I answer this question across scales. So we'll go through each of these in the presentation today. I start in chapter 1 from a global perspective, looking at 449 different companies' approaches to sustainable sourcing. We'll then zoom in to one specific company, looking at the environmental impacts of a major food retailer based out of South Africa. And finally, we'll expand back out to the cocoa industry, looking at how these sustainable sourcing practices have evolved over time. Before I dive in to my research, I use the term sustainability throughout this presentation. And academics understand sustainability as a system that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And academics understand that this necessarily takes into account the complex social, environmental, and economic trade-offs inherent in this system. However, I work with companies, and I found that companies understand sustainability as anything that addresses either social or environmental issues, and rarely kind of understand many of these trade-offs. I will use the term sustainability to relate to this kind of company understanding, and if there's time at the end, would love to dive back into this much more complex system that we often don't see companies looking at. So with that, I'll start with my first chapter. This is Companies' Contributions to Sustainability Through Global Supply Chains. This is in collaboration with Joanne de Zegher and Eric Lambin. And what really motivated us for this research was at the start of my PhD, I was seeing really exciting headlines, like Whole Foods was going to monitor the impact of their environmental programs. Unilever had committed to 100% sustainable sourcing by 2020. And Adidas was going to reuse ocean plastics to reformulate their products. So wow, companies are doing all these really amazing things around sustainability in their supply chains. But were these just headlines coming across my desk, or was this a signal of a larger scale change? So were all companies doing something about sustainability, or is it really only these kind of leaders in the field, such as Unilever and Adidas? So the research questions we looked to address were: how are food, apparel, and wood products companies addressing sustainability in their supply chains? How do these sustainable sourcing practices address the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? And what factors influence the adoption of sustainable sourcing practices by companies? To answer these questions, we took a random sample of 449 food, wood product, and apparel companies across 12 of the largest OECD stock exchanges. So these are publicly listed companies, and we focused on these sectors to provide a wide range of types of companies, but they all had similar supply chain structures, so we were able to compare their sourcing strategies across. We then looked at the 2015 company sustainability annual reports and websites, and we did content analysis of the prevalence and characteristics of the sustainable sourcing practices in those documents. Content analysis is a qualitative research approach that carefully documents and defines a priority, the kind of items that you're looking for in the text, and then goes through the text and identifies those areas. And finally, we did a logistic regression of company characteristics and how they were associated with SSP adoption. It's important to note that all of this is correlational in nature because this is a cross-section of companies. So first, we found 16 distinct sustainable sourcing practices. Sustainable sourcing practices we define as voluntary initiatives that companies undertake to improve the social and/or environmental issues of the suppliers that they work with. So these include things like certification. Many of you may be familiar with logos like Fair Trade or Rainforest Alliance on your coffee or your bananas. But there was a wide range of other projects that companies undertook. For example, company-led standard is when an individual company sets their own standard to dictate sustainability initiatives through their supply chain. There were things outside of standards, including companies involved in training their suppliers around social or environmental issues, or investing with their suppliers to improve the environmental management, for example, helping to retrofit a factory, or providing inputs or seedlings from the farms that they work with. We found that 52% of companies engage in some form of sustainable sourcing practices. In particular, these are the 16 practices that we identified, and what to highlight here is that by far the most common approach to sustainable sourcing were these company-led standards. Again, when companies were defining sustainability and mandating that through their supply chain. Find that over 40% of companies adopted a company-led standard. In contrast, much of the academic literature has focused on multi-stakeholder standards and NGO-led standards, such as these Rainforest Alliance or Fair Trade initiatives. So this is really kind of a glass half full approach, right? There's 52% of companies who are doing something. However, we also found substantial limitations even within those companies that were doing something around sustainable sourcing. We'll go through a few of those right now. First, we found that 71% of sustainable sourcing practices only cover one or a subset of input materials. So what does this mean? It's lunchtime. Imagine you're eating a hamburger. That hamburger, in a very simplified form, is made up of a cow, some tomatoes for your ketchup, the wheat for the buns, and a nice cardboard packaging to kind of put it onto your plate. But what we found was that often companies were only addressing one or a few of these inputs into their production. So for example, perhaps in the hamburger, they were working with their wheat farmers to reduce the water use, but they weren't addressing the potential deforestation or methane emissions coming from their cattle operations. On average, we found that companies were addressing 3 to 4 input materials through their sustainable sourcing practices. And the most common of those were palm oil and wood. Second, we found that the majority of sustainable sourcing practices only apply to a single tier of a supply chain. So again, here's our very simplified supply chain. A first tier are if you're kind of the buying firm at the far end, it's the organization that you have a direct relationship with. So perhaps the manufacturer that you source directly from, or in some cases, that might be the farm level if you're sourcing directly from the farm. We found that 60.5% of sustainable sourcing practices addressed only the first tier of the supply chain. Second, there's the intermediate tiers, so between the farm and the first tier. And it's often a concern that much of the social and environmental challenges are kind of hidden in the supply chain in these sub-tiers. We found only 1.5% of sustainable sourcing practices were involved in addressing these sub-tier suppliers. Finally, we found about 35% of sustainable sourcing practices did go down to the farm level. These were primarily through these external standards like Rainforest Alliance or the Forest Stewardship Council. And only 3% of practices address the entire chain, kind of working with each step of the supplier to ensure sustainability throughout each of those steps. Again, in this presentation, we looked at the Sustainable Development Goals as kind of our definition for sustainability. So United Nations set forth as a global community 17 goals around sustainability as a goal to achieve by 2030. And what we found was that most sustainable sourcing practices only focused on a small subset of these SDGs. So by definition, all SSPs relate to SDG 12, responsible production. But we also found that the majority of these practices dealt with just 2 other goals. SDG 8 around workers' rights, and SDG 16 around compliance with national laws, leaving many of the other important goals, for the most part, unaddressed. Certainly, there were companies doing really innovative work to deal with poverty and gender through their supply chains, but those were the exception and not the norm. So what types of companies were uptaking these sustainable sourcing practices? We found in general that large, consumer-facing companies with high brand value, located in countries with substantial NGO pressure, were associated with an increased uptake of sustainable sourcing practices. So to think about this, if our results suggest that a firm like Aquatic Foods Group PLC would be less likely to adopt these sustainable sourcing practices than a major company such as Coca-Cola. Aquatic Foods Group PLC, maybe few of you have heard of it. It's a small company that sells business to business, so it sells seafood. It buys seafood from fishermen and sells it to other businesses that then package it and put it on their shelves, so it has no relationship to consumers. It's quite small. It's based in China where there's limited NGO activism, and it does not have a significant brand. In contrast, Coca-Cola is large, has a brand worth an estimated $80 billion US, and is headquartered in the United States where there is substantial NGO pressure. For those of you that prefer numbers, this is looking at our first difference results. So these are just a few of the many variables that we looked at that I wanted to highlight here. So holding all else constant, a change in revenues from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile is associated with an 11 percentage point increase in likelihood of adopting a sustainable sourcing practice. Similarly, going from being not a consumer-facing to a consumer-facing company is associated with an 11 percentage increase as well, and it continues down. So to wrap up, we learned that we provided a representative understanding of existing sustainable sourcing practices. We found that companies are addressing sustainable sourcing in their supply chains, but many of these practices and the companies that adopt them are limited in scope. So I just took you through kind of a very broad global perspective of sustainable sourcing. Now we'll kind of zoom into one specific company, in this case, looking at improving environmental practices in agricultural supply chains, an analysis across scales. This is in collaboration with Eric Lambin and Jens Heinmüller. In this, the kind of motivation for this work came from chapter 1, where we saw that over 40% of companies were doing sustainable sourcing through these company-led standards, when they were defining sustainability and mandating that to their suppliers. However, there's very little empirical evidence of the effectiveness of these programs. As you might understand, companies aren't super willing to give kind of their entire supply base information to nosy academics to evaluate the effectiveness of their programs. And there's certainly some concern within the NGO and a number of academics that companies may be using these own programs to be as a form of greenwashing. So there's an existing sustainability standard out there, but you're defining your own. Why would you do that? So there's some skepticism there. So this kind of motivation took me to Cape Town, South Africa, where I collaborated with Woolworths, the high-end food retailer, similar to kind of the Whole Foods of Southern Africa. They have about an 8% market penetration in the retail space and are throughout 15 countries in Southern Africa. And their kind of branding focuses around quality and sustainability. I focused on their Farming for the Future program, which is their flagship company-led program, improving the environmental impacts of the farms that they work with in the fresh produce sector. And the Farming for the Future case was interesting to me because it was seen as kind of a best-in-class case. So when there's very little research on a topic, it's sometimes helpful to study kind of a best-in-class case to say, if we don't see impact here, it would be unlikely to see it in other places. So we saw this as kind of a critical case because there were stringent practices, it was third-party audited, there was a continual improvement model, and there was a direct supply chain. So that means that Woolworths had a direct relationship with each of the growers that they worked with. And from the literature, many of these are suggested to help improve the effectiveness of these supply chain programs. So in this, I looked at how does Woolworths' company-led standard affect the uptake of environmental farm management practices among farmers. To answer this question, we used a three-pronged empirical approach. First, used a panel data set of third-party audits across 953 audits and 228 farms, looking at the program as it rolled out from 2009 to 2015. We then used a farm and year fixed effects model to look at the within-unit changes of each of those farmers. We also conducted a cross-sectional survey with 117 Woolworths growers and 43 randomly selected Global GAP certified farmers. Global GAP is the industry environmental standard that Woolworths requires as a baseline for all of their growers. And finally, we conducted over 90 semi-structured interviews with Woolworths growers, farmers not involved in the program, as well as the auditors and Woolworths staff. We looked at the adoption of environmental farm management practices. It's important to note here that we are looking at the adoption of practices, not ultimate outcomes, such as kind of reduced carbon emissions or building soil carbon. We looked at the adoption of practices. We binned those practices into three groups based on existing literature. Legal practices are legally mandated by South African law. However, it's important to note that no farmer reported environmental audit from the government across my interviews. Second were technical practices. So these are non-farm management related practices, either related to data management or kind of non-farm practices such as energy policy, having a recycling system in place, monitoring and measuring your soil moisture. And finally, I looked at fundamental farm management practices, were major changes to more conservation-oriented farm management practices. And this distinction between technical and fundamental practices comes from the literature in the social auditing compliance work of a number of scholars. They've shown that audits are fairly effective in addressing these technical practices, such as signposting and things like that, but less effective in making these more fundamental shifts towards protecting workers' rights. So we use that similar structure in evaluating our results. So here I'll show you the summary panel analysis What we have here is the estimated effect of the Farming for the Future program. So to the right of the dotted line would be an increase of a positive effect, and to the left would be negative, and we'll show 95% confidence intervals. So we see about a 14 percentage point increase in likelihood of adoption of legal practices associated with the Farming for the Future program. Second, we find about a 9 percentage point increase in likelihood of adopting technical practices, again associated with the Farming for the Future program. And finally, we see a small but statistically significant increase in adoption of these fundamental farm management practices. So from the qualitative results from my surveys, we looked at, okay, why were we seeing positive improvements among farmers? Kind of what were the mechanisms to drive this change? Two key things came out. First, it was the advice provided by trained auditors that really helped farmers drive improvements in their practices. So traditionally, auditors are not allowed to give consulting advice to the farms that they visit. They come, they ask questions, and they leave. And frequently, these auditors are not trained in farm management practices. In contrast, the Woolworths program really encouraged a consultation between the auditor and the farmer, and all of the auditors were trained in agronomy and soil science. So as one farmer put it, when a Global Gap auditor comes on your farm, he says, nice trees. When a Farming for the Future auditor drives onto your farm, he asks, what are we going to do about those alien trees on your farm? So a real difference in kind of understanding of the farm ecosystem. A second key mechanism was a more partnership-based approach between Woolworths and their growers. So in contrast to many retailers that will buy from one farm in one year and another from another farm in the next, Woolworths was largely committed to longer-term relationships with their farmers. They did not have long-term contracts, but often they worked over 30 years with the same farmers. And this really kind of incentivized farmers to actually invest in this environmental program because they saw Woolworths as a long-term partner in the change on their farm. So as one grower explained, most retailers care that you deliver beans. Woolworths cares how you grow your beans. It's much more of a collaboration. So the kind of contributions of Chapter 2 really looked at, we had provided empirical evidence that company-led standards can drive change. We found that advice provided by trained auditors was helpful in driving practice adoption among farmers. And finally, a partnership-based approach with suppliers was really helpful in driving that change. So now, kind of zooming back out a little bit, my final chapter looked at the evolution of the chocolate industry's sustainable sourcing practices. So the motivation for this work was in Chapter 1, I was taking a snapshot of practices that companies were doing. In Chapter 2, I was really diving into one specific program. But I was increasingly seeing headlines that were showing some dynamicism in these sustainable sourcing practices. So Mondelez, the major chocolate giant, dropped fair trade, the certification, in preference for their own supply chain initiative. Unilever radically made transparent their palm oil supply chain in a major change in their sourcing strategies. And Sainsbury, a major UK retailer, also moved away from certification in preference for their own programs. So there's a lot of dynamicism in this. It's not kind of a static approach that companies were taking. So I asked kind of how and why have chocolate manufacturers' approaches to sustainable cocoa sourcing evolved over the last 2 decades. So a bit of background on cocoa production. 70% of cocoa produced is from West Africa, primarily Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. Most cocoa is produced by small-scale farmers of under 3 hectares. And there's major social and environmental challenges associated with cocoa production. The ones that have gotten the most media attention are most recently deforestation. So cocoa has contributed to major deforestation throughout the biodiversity hotspots of Western Africa. And child labor. In this case, hazardous child labor, which is the case of when children are unable to go to school or conducting hazardous forms of labor that interferes kind of with their well-being. The cocoa value chain, I kind of walked through at the beginning, is quite long and complex. Farmers will sell to middlemen, that will then sell often to major traders such as Cargill, then on to manufacturers, Hershey's and the like, before getting to retailers and consumers. And it's highly fragmented, so there's lots and lots of farmers, I think an estimated 5 million cocoa farmers, but it's highly consolidated downstream. So it's estimated that 4 traders hold 60% of all cocoa produced, and about 40% of all chocolate is sold by 5 major chocolate manufacturers. But within this kind of larger value chain, there's significant stakeholder engagement. So external stakeholders include both the producing and consuming country governments, NGOs, certifiers, and the media. And this stakeholder kind of ecosystem is important in kind of influencing the practices within the specific supply chain. So in this, I reviewed over 200 company, trader, and NGO documents from 2000 to 2017. I interviewed over 50 stakeholders in the cocoa value chain, including 5 of the largest cocoa traders and 5 of the largest chocolate manufacturers. And finally, I analyzed this information for trends, motivations, and key decision points. So what did we find? Starting in 2000, companies were largely doing nothing about sustainability in their cocoa supply chains. I think a great quote that kind of exemplified this was in Nestle's environmental report in 2000. They said, Nestle doesn't produce raw materials, nor does it own or operate any farms. It goes on to say, so please leave us alone, that's not our problem. But then we see quite a bit of stakeholder pressure. So there's a significant media spotlight on slavery and child labor in the cocoa supply chain. And this helped to drive an attempted regulation by the US government to regulate chocolate and the slavery, to prevent slavery in the chocolate industry. In response to these stakeholder pressures, the industry came together and said, no need to regulate us, no need to stop eating chocolate. We're going to come together and pool our resources and develop these industry initiatives where we all kind of contribute to improving the sustainability of cocoa production. These are things like the World Cocoa Foundation and the Harkin-Engel Voluntary Protocol. But then what we saw in kind of between 2005 and 2010 was a significant shift in the way NGOs were targeting chocolate companies. So previously they had said, all cocoa is bad because there's all of these really major environmental challenges. Now they were saying Hershey's is bad because it's using slave labor in its supply chain. So all of a sudden really focusing on the individual brands in their targeting. And what NGOs were calling for was an increased kind of commitment by companies to sustainable sourcing through these NGO-led initiatives. And it worked. So they were able to make 4 of the 5 largest chocolate companies commit to 100% sustainably certified cocoa by 2020. So the main certifiers in this space are Fair Trade, UTZ, and Rainforest Alliance. So it was seen as a major win for the NGO and certifying community. As one major chocolate manufacturer explained, most of the journalists, NGOs, activists, all the stakeholders believed that certification was the solution. And this happened about between 2009 and 2012 that these major certification commitments took place. But starting around 2012, there was beginning to be increasing evidence that certification was perhaps not driving as much change as they had promised. So initially, certification was seen as the solution. It was going to eradicate poverty, stop deforestation, end child labor. And both NGOs and companies were beginning to see examples of, child labor on certified farms, still seeing farmers living in extreme poverty despite being certified. And so there began to be a fracturization in the NGO community. So historically, NGOs always supported certifiers as the solution. Around this time, NGOs were starting to say, no, what we really want to see is impact. Whether or not you're certified is kind of not fully irrelevant, but not as important anymore. And so as one major NGO who was a major supporter of certification at the beginning said, we really saw certification as a savior 20 years ago, but now we are much more critical of the approach. So now, kind of in 2015 to 2017, we've seen a rise of what I call own supply chain initiatives. So this is when companies, so in some cases, this is, for example, like Mondelez is a wholesale move away from certification. So they no longer use fair trade as they're certifying, to certify their cocoa. Instead, they use Cocoa Life, which is their own supply chain initiative. But more often, we see companies continuing to use certification, but increasingly focusing only on the farmers within their own supply chain. So traditionally, in certification, you can buy from any farm that's certified, so you don't often know which farmer you're working with. Increasingly, companies are committing to only work with set farmers that are within their physical supply chain. This brings them much more in close relationship with Cargill and the other major traders that kind of barter that relationship. And they're increasingly providing additional support to farmers, such as training and financing, to help farmers kind of move beyond just the certification audits. There's certainly some concerns with this own supply chain initiative. There's substantial value to have a third-party group kind of looking out and assessing the effectiveness of the certification in this case. To date, all of the major chocolate manufacturers have continued to use verification in their programs, but some NGOs are concerned that they might, in the future, kind of move away from that. There's also concern that the most marginalized farmers will not be involved in these programs because chocolate manufacturers prefer to work with kind of the best farmers that are organized in cooperatives or producing groups, leaving many of the unorganized farmers, which are often the poorest, kind of out of this supply chain. And this certainly isn't the end of the evolution that we've seen over the last 20 years. We're increasingly seeing government interventions involved in the cocoa space. We're seeing substantial consuming country legislation, especially in the EU, where countries are requiring companies to report on what they're doing in their supply chain. France has even gone so far as to hold some companies responsible for actions in their supply chain. And on the producing country government side, there's increased involvement of major producing countries, such as Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, in the regulation of their cocoa supply chain. So to conclude chapter 3, we saw that chocolate companies are increasingly taking responsibility for actions within their own supply chain. External stakeholders have been a major driver of this evolution. And governments are becoming kind of more active in sustainability regulations, suggesting there's some potential for additional evolution down the line. So to wrap up, we saw that companies are addressing sustainable sourcing, but often those practices are limited in scope. We found that company standards can be effective if implemented really thoughtfully. And finally, sustainable sourcing practices are a dynamic phenomenon that continue to change over time. And from this analysis across scales, we can also begin to kind of look at kind of learnings across these different projects. So for example, in 2015, we saw for the most part, companies were just dealing with their first-tier suppliers. But in the chocolate industry, we're seeing them evolve their practices to beginning to work with their full supply chain. So we might see kind of this more dynamic evolution over time. Similarly, much of the learnings from a very different supply chain in South Africa could be useful to kind of inform these new company-led programs that companies are doing in the cocoa supply chain. So what are some of the broader implications of this work? First, as I kind of explored a bit in the beginning, I believe there's substantial sustainability trade-offs that companies aren't always fully addressing. So an example of this is Woolworth's environmental program saw significant improvements in environmental practices, but said nothing about the many social and kind of worker welfare issues facing the farm workers. And I think there's substantial trade-offs that haven't been fully explored by companies, and I unfortunately have not kind of fully dug into some of those trade-offs in this research. Second, returning to the beginning, we have to remember that this is a complex policy ecosystem. So I looked at companies' role in addressing many of these sustainability challenges. However, those are necessarily embedded in the work of kind of governments, NGOs, and all of those policies interact, and that's an important thing to consider. Finally, as I hope to move from this PhD back into the private sector to work on sustainable procurement, I will kind of go forward with my eyes wide open, understanding that this is no kind of silver bullet to solving many of these challenges. And companies can and should be part of the solution, but it's going to take kind of all hands on deck to really address many of these major challenges. So with that, I'd like to thank the many, many people that helped make this PhD possible. First, to my fantastic committee, Roz, Eric, Jens, Bill, and Hao. Thank you for chairing. I couldn't have asked for a more supportive committee, both for my research and for me as a person. This research would definitely not have been possible without the fantastic work of an army of research associates. So Sarah, Kathy, Zach, Julie, Elizabeth, Mackenzie, and Zach Jobert, thank you so much. You really made this process both a joy, and I learned a lot from each of you. The E-IPER staff really makes our lives as PhD students in E-IPER incredibly easy. We're able to focus on research, and they kind of solve everything else that kind of goes on. So thank you, Sue, Anne-Marie, Gabby, Anjana, Jen, Deb, and Ben, for making it such a joy to come to work each day. And there's so many other kind of friends, colleagues, mentors, and collaborators that I'd love to thank. And finally, to my family, thank you so much.
Thank you. We now invite questions from the public.
What do you think is an effective way for government to intervene in this situation? If, in fact, regulations are becoming a more prominent part of this landscape, how would they go about doing something that hasn't been done before?
Yeah, so what we've seen is often government regulations are a really effective base. So companies typically kind of can help innovate and create new practices and often work with kind of the best in-class actors is what we're finding. And governments are a really important part of kind of making sure that there's a minimum baseline. You know, there's fundamental human rights across every company, regardless if you're in a supply chain that focuses on sustainability. So that's a really important part. You know, certainly, I think someone pointed out to me the other day that, yeah, 500 companies touch 70% of the world production, but 200 countries touch 100% of the world production. So that's certainly true. And so again, government regulations are incredibly important, but I think there can be a lot of complementarities between the kind of private and public governance.
Great talk. Thank you so much. So you sort of talked about how public pressure can often motivate this, especially when there's public scrutiny of specific companies. So I'm curious in what you see as the role of sort of individual consumers in sort of spurring this kind of change, and more as it seems like companies are trying to market themselves as sustainable. Is that something that a consumer can rely on? Like if I go into the supermarket and it says fairly traded versus fair trade, sometimes it's hard to know what it means, and do most of those claims really measure up to what the company is trying to get the consumer to buy into?
That's a whole nother dissertation, but yeah. No, it's incredibly important. So yes, we definitely saw suggestions that the kind of consumer pressure was driving change. Within the chocolate industry, for these major manufacturers, these are Mars, Nestle, pretty low quality chocolate. It wasn't the consumer demand that was really driving their decisions. So they didn't see consumers really being willing to pay more for fair trade chocolate. But what they were very afraid of was kind of consumer backlash if there was a negative kind of event in their supply chain. So if child labor was found out in their supply chain, consumers, they found, responded very negatively to that. And so that really incentivized these companies. So I think that's, certainly interesting. Can we get every consumer to actually pay more? The evidence suggests that's going to stay kind of a niche product. But can we say we care about these issues and we will penalize you if you're not doing a good job and being a good global citizen? And I think that certainly has made kind of movement in the chocolate industry. As far as can you trust kind of company commitments, I don't know. I think what I would encourage and what I have been encouraging companies is, Woolworths has put forward publicly through an academic study the impacts of their programs. Like, why don't you? And I think increasingly as data collection, revolutions in data collection, I would hope that companies would increasingly say, we're doing good work and here's a credible kind of evaluation of our impact and we're going to stand behind that. We've seen some of the leaders, Nike's also kind of been open to kind of exploring the impacts of their supply chain, but will other companies kind of follow suit? That's definitely what I would see as a real success.
So in chapter 1, one of the things we pointed out was that intermediaries are less involved in sustainable practices. And I'm wondering, based on chapter 2 and 3, like one of the things you drew out was that if the high-brand consumer-facing retailers are able to take control of the full supply chain, then that they can affect the processes that happen in the middle. But in lieu of that, what are the other factors that you found seem to make a difference in moving the kind of intermediary actors in the supply chain towards more sustainable practices?
Right. So certainly there's some suggestion that, especially around environmental issues, kind of cutting environmental, being more environmentally friendly also is good for your bottom line. So these kind of win-win examples. So that's certainly one way. We did find an association of being aware of the risks of your supply chain. So saying, our supply chain is at risk for all of these things. You're also more likely to adopt sustainable sourcing practices. So perhaps making companies more aware of the really substantial risks to with climate change kind of disrupting their supply or things like that. That might help. But it is certainly, really targeting those. And I think that goes back to some might not really kind of take up these practices. And so maybe that's a role for government to step in. And I think another point there is these kind of win-win solutions that we so often hear about most often kind of really tie into environmental practices. I think there can be win-wins on really treating your workers better and, respecting human rights, but often that's associated with paying workers more. And that's often harder in kind of a short-term thinking company to see the benefits for. And that's where I really think it's important for kind of government policies to step in to support the most marginalized workers. Pat.
So, very nice presentation. It's really interesting research. On the second chapter with Woolworths, and you broke up those 3 buckets between legal, technical, and the third bucket. It was interesting that the legal bucket had better adoption. And it seems that the connection between the feedback of the auditors was a big deal. But on the third bucket, I was looking at that, yet integrated pest management and a bunch of these other things. Those programs generally in the other applications are poorly adopted because nobody understands how to do it. So I was curious if there was like an organizational change management or a process connection, if you think it would actually improve. Because that was the least of the Woolworths program, the one that was most poorly adopted or accepted.
Right. Yeah. So on the legal kind of why we think we saw a substantial increase in adoption of legal, kind of a few things that might be driving that. First, farmers also don't want to be caught being illegal. So once it's kind of shown that they're doing something illegal, they don't want kind of government intervention. So that often incentivizes them. Similarly, the academic literature suggests that Woolworths should be more attuned to legal issues because their supply will get disrupted if one of their suppliers is caught kind of breaking the South African law. So that's maybe why we see a kind of increased adoption there. With the fundamental practices, yes, so I think one of the key differences that came out in my qualitative interviews was, changing to integrated pest management practices is a really major shift. You need to understand the beneficials in your specific area. You might have a reduction in kind of quality as you're kind of optimizing this, this new approach. And so it was that consulting and kind of support that Woolworths provided that really helped them. Why did we still see a pretty small kind of change? It's still a hard kind of decision for these farmers to make. We also were looking at all farmers kind of, regardless of how long they've been in the program. And there might be suggestion that kind of that change would take 3, 4, maybe even 5 years to really fully adopt. And we were only looking at kind of binary, was it fully adopted or not? So.
Yeah, it was really excellent research and excellent presentation, so thank you. On the piece on the evolution of cocoa supply chains, did you see anything, so when companies moved to more in-house supply chain work, after seeing what's not working with the certification programs, how would you characterize the changes in those programs compared to what certifications were already offering?
Yeah, you know, it's really unique. I could tell you with every single major manufacturer how they kind of relate, but in general, again, they're still using verification. So in the case of Mondelez moved towards Cocoa Life, which is their own program, they actually use FlowCert, which is Fairtrade's auditing body, to ensure that the practices are actually happening. There seems to be some less transparency. You know, it's very clear what the standards are. They're published on these certifier websites. That hasn't always been the case. Though we're increasingly seeing transparency. So for example, Nestle now publishes exactly how much they spent on their Nestle Cocoa Plan, which is their company standard in cocoa, and kind of a breakdown of this is the amount that went to the premiums, this is the amount that went to training, to auditing. And so that transparency is really helpful. So certainly there's some concern that there's less transparency now. And again, one of the major shifts is instead of just kind of an audit, they're increasingly layering on additional programs. So realizing that farmers need access to inputs, and so supporting that system is something else that's kind of differentiated the programs.
Some of these questions have already answered some of mine, but I'm curious. So your chapter 2 about Woolworths. The results. Were you able to share these with them, and did these results actually affect the way that they were going to maybe change the practices in the future?
Yeah, no, I worked closely with the senior food management team to presented this to their senior leadership and said, here's key management takeaways. And so I'm actually helping them think through the kind of Farming for the Future 2.0, which should involve kind of many of these social issues. So instead of having a standalone environmental audit, we're going to be combining, hopefully, these social and environmental issues in the same system to try to drive some of those potential synergies. So they said they listened to me. They seem to be kind of evolving things. We'll kind of see what comes out of the other end.
In chapter 1, you mentioned that most company SSPs cover a single input material or a small subset of input materials, and mainly palm oil and wood. I wonder if your research covered any of the motivation behind that. Is it tied to global supply? Is it tied to perceived environmental impact, or to the brand in general?
Yeah, so that research didn't explicitly look at kind of why palm oil and wood, but from kind of other studies, it's been suggested that palm oil and wood have gotten a lot of attention in the media. So there's been a huge campaign, particularly around palm oil, that's gotten consumers, like people come up to me all the time and say, like, should I use palm oil? And I'm not the expert there. But so that certainly probably contributed to it. They do have major environmental impacts. So palm and wood are two major contributors to deforestation, which has a whole host of negative kind of externalities. So those are likely. There's also some suggestion that kind of visible products are more likely to kind of have companies do something about it. I would say palm oil isn't particularly visible, but wood often is. So there's certainly a lot of hypotheses out there that suggest kind of why those and not others.
Thanks, Tannis. I feel like I've asked you this question before, but we'll just see what you think about it today. So chapters 1 and 2 are looking at adoption of practices in this sort of 0-1 framework. You either have a SSP or you don't, or you're either doing the legally required thing or you're not. To what extent for your research were you able to understand if there's variation in sort of how good sustainability practices are when they are adopted, or how bad the lack of adoption is when things are not adopted? And I guess, so that's part 1 of my question. And part two is like how that relates to these two different definitions of sustainability. So like companies just say it's anything that's social and or environmental, whereas as academics we have this more nuanced understanding of what it might mean. And is that related in any way to sort of the difficulty in assessing like how good things are versus just doing them in name or in practice?
Yeah. So for the first part, I mean, the intensity is a really good question. And in the first chapter, we tried to get at some characteristics that might be associated with kind of how strong is the practice. So we looked at whether it was third-party audited or not, what tier it applied to, kind of how much kind of scope did it cover related to the SDGs. So that helped us a little bit. But yeah, it was either you have a company code of conduct or you don't. But as we saw with Woolworths, they have a fantastic code of conduct, company standard. And, some company standards say, don't do these things. And we're not going to check if you do or not. So those are very different programs. And so yeah, that's certainly a limitation. And future work could perhaps gradiate that more. That involves kind of judgments, which can often be difficult. And certainly similarly with the Farming for the Future adoption, you see kind of, farmers starting to think about rotating their crops, but they're not rotating their crops, so that doesn't count. But you've seen a shift in the way they're thinking about the importance of crop rotation, and that's not picked up. And so, but, at the end of the day, at least within the full adoption is what we think at least will drive environmental outcomes, because that's what the kind of existing literature has said, if you do really thoughtful crop rotation, these are the benefits, not if you think about crop rotation, that's not going to help as much. So certainly the intensity there. As far as your second question, around kind of how companies think, why companies think about these social and environmental issues, I don't really know. I think companies like to get credit for anything that they do. And so if it's social, if it's environmental, like great, it's sustainability. I mean, I've talked a lot to companies about these trade-offs, and certainly leaders are thinking a bit about this. But, I think the cocoa example is a really good one. I mean, why are farmers deforesting? Like in large part because they need productive land and they don't have the money to buy fertilizer, to make their existing land productive. And so it's cheaper to go out and burn forest. But instead of saying, wow, maybe poverty is a real driver there, they're saying, oh, let's stop deforestation. And similarly with child labor, like why are farmers using child labor? It's not because they don't want their kids to succeed. It's likely tied to poverty. And even though there's like these very clear, at least from my perspective, linkages between poverty, child labor, and deforestation, companies still have their child policy, their deforestation policy, and they try just not to talk about poverty. So I think we still have a long ways to go there. And last question. Great.
So think about the timeline of within Chapter 3 of Cocoa Sustainability. In 2012, when NGOs started shifting away from advocating for those certification programs, what was the balance there between abandoning them completely and advocating for something else, or trying to fix the fair trade certification programs?
Yeah, great question. I don't want to, it's easy to kind of paint a simplified picture. Certainly, a lot of NGOs still support certification and have worked really hard to say, okay, how do we drive additional impact? And the kind of meta governance group ICO, which focuses a lot on certification, has said, let's start focusing more on impact. How can we be driving? So there's certainly innovation happening in the certification space. Really exciting. I would say for the most part, it hasn't been a wholesale move away. It's saying, hey, certifiers, start doing more. Like, let's actually try to be driving impact. And the certifiers are certainly innovating as well. So it's not kind of let's all get rid of certification. It's this isn't working. Either how do we make it better or how do we shift to other systems? And there's a range. I mean, certainly some of the activist NGOs are saying, forget certification. If there's deforestation in your supply chain, we're coming after you. And that's more of kind of, but they're always a bit more extreme. So a whole range.
Well, thank you very much, Tannis. Thank you for